There have been many dragon Pokemon over the years that discard energy to do massive amounts of damage, but rarely have these cards actually lived up to the massive hype that they've had. However, the new Raging Bolt EX is hoping to break this trend, as it looks to be one of the strongest attackers in the entire Temporal Forces set. So today I'll be breaking down my current list for the deck at the request of Austin Knowles over on Patreon. And if you want to put in your requests for any decks you'd like me to cover in the future, be sure to check out the Rare Candy Patreon. Link will be down below in the description. But with that being said, be sure to smack that like button to feed the algorithm, and let's break down my current deck list for Raging Bolt EX. So kicking things off with our main attacker here, Raging Bolt EX. And while the second attack is definitely the main one we're going to focus on, the first one honestly isn't that bad on the first turn of the game. You just discard your hand and draw 6. But the second attack, like I said, is really going to be the star of the show. It costs a lightning and a fighting energy, and then you discard any amount of energy from any of your Pokemon, and it does 70 for each energy you discard. Similar to other Pokemon like Chien-Pao EX or Golden Goat EX, we have an unlimited damage cap here to easily knock out anything we might go up against. But of course the issue is we're discarding energy from our field every turn, and we have to find ways at actually getting it back in play to be able to keep doing these big nuking attacks. And that's where Sandy Shocks EX is going to come into play. This guy came out back in Paradox Rift, and it might finally have a deck that it could see play in. And that's for this ability. If your opponent has 4 or fewer prize cards remaining, you can attach a fighting energy from your discard to Sandy Shocks EX. That's essentially a plus 70 damage for each of these that you have in play. From there, all we need is 2 energy to power up our Raging Bolt. And though you won't use it that often, Sandy Shocks does at least have an attack you can fall back on from time to time. It just does 200 and you can't attack on the next turn. But between this ability and Professor Sada, if you do need to switch gears and attack with this guy out of nowhere, it isn't that hard to do. And our only other attacker of the deck is going to be 1 copy of Koraidon. We're playing it mainly for this first attack. It does 30 for each ancient Pokemon that we have in play. Honestly, we rarely will have a full field of ancient Pokemon, but you can usually hit for around 120 with this attack. And honestly, that's enough most of the time, since we can use this guy to pick off low HP basic Pokemon in the early game, and or force our opponent into a 7 prize game. We have a copy of Radiant Greninja for that Concealed Cards ability. We are reliant on accelerating energy out of the discard pile, so Concealed Cards make sense. We can pitch our energies away and see some extra cards every turn. We have a Squawkabilly EX, of course, for that Squawk and Seize ability. This archetype functions pretty similarly to the Roaring Moon EX decks that have been floating around up until now. And likewise, we're trying to have these big explosive turn 1 attacks, and we will need the help from Squawkabilly to discard our hand and draw 6 to be able to see a ton of cards in a turn. And our final Pokemon of the list is just going to be a copy of Mew EX. We're not really using the attack on this thing, we're more so just playing it for the free retreat, as well as its ability that allows us to draw cards until we have 3 in hand. Our deck is very reliant on playing Professor Sada turn after turn, and a well-timed Iono or Roxanne can honestly be pretty devastating for this deck, so we need to make sure that in the late game, our opponent can't disrupt our hand and shut us out of the game. Speaking of which, we have 4 copies of Professor Sada's Vitality. We choose 2 ancient Pokemon we have in play and attach a basic energy from discard pile to each of them. This is really the card that makes the entire deck work, since we are discarding energy from our Pokemon every single turn. We're going to need the help of Sada most turns of the game to be able to power up a fresh Raging Bolt. But from there, we also have a copy of Iono just for a little bit of late game hand disruption, since each player shuffles their hand, puts at the bottom of the deck, and gets a new hand for each prize card they have remaining. And from there, 1 copy of Boss's Orders just to be able to choose what we want to attack into. I'm sure you've noticed this is a very low count of Boss's Orders, but don't fear, we do have some other gusting options that we'll get to a little bit later in this list. For our stadiums, we have 3 copies of Pokestop. We discard the top 3 cards of our deck and keep any item cards that were there. This is a very aggressive deck where we're trying to have these big explosive early game turns, and Pokestop is going to help us out with that since most of this deck is actually item cards. But we also have 1 copy of Collapse Stadium in the deck. There might be certain matchups where we actually might want to deny our own Pokestops from our opponent, so in the mirror match or against decks like Chien-Pao or Golden Go. But also, it's not uncommon for us to have a bench-sitting liability like a Squawkabilly EX or a Mew EX, so there will be times where we will need to use Collapse Stadium to take those options off the field for our opponent. And next up for our Pokemon tool cards, as you would expect, we have 3 copies of Ancient Booster Energy Capsule, just to give our ancient Pokemon 60 more HP. So if we have one of these on our Raging Bolt EX, it's going to get bumped all the way up to a massive 300 HP, which is pretty insane for just a basic Pokemon. And of course, likewise, we do have a few other ancient Pokemon we can always throw this on to as well. But getting into our items, like I said guys, we have a ton of them. To kick off, we have 4 copies of Pokegear 3.0, where we look at the top 7 cards of our deck, get a supporter we find there, and put it into our hand. As I mentioned, we're basically just trying to recycle Sada turn after turn to keep getting back our energies, so we need to make sure that we can reliably find them when we need them. Next, we have 4 copies of Trekking Shoes to be able to look at the top card of our deck. We can keep it or discard it and draw another one. So this is a way we can sometimes toss away energy to fuel our Professor Sadas, and also just allows us to turbo through our deck a little bit quicker to have these big aggressive openings. We are an all basic deck, so we do have 4 copies of Nest Ball to find any of our Pokemon, but we also have 4 copies of Ultra Ball as well, because we actually do kind of want this discarding effect, since we can toss away energies with it to be able to fuel our Professor Sadas. Next up, we have 3 copies of Pokemon Catcher. So it's just boss's orders, but as a coin flip item card. But the reason we're playing these is because not only are we sort of an aggressive deck, but also because we are so reliant on Professor Sada every turn, or most turns I should say, it is a little bit more difficult to take a turn off to play a different supporter. And we also have 1 copy of the new Prime Catcher as our ace spec of choice. Unlike Pokemon Catcher, this is not a coin flip, but you switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with their active, and you also switch with one of yours. I think if you want to, you could play the Awakening Drum ace spec, but I think the deck's pretty consistent even without it, so instead I kind of like having the extra aggression here. We have 3 Earthen Vessel, so we discard a card from our hand and get 2 energies from our deck. Since our main attackers are dragon Pokemon, we do have to play 2 different types of energies, so Earthen Vessel is going to help us find the exact one that we might need, and of course it's just another way we can toss energy into our discard pile. We have a copy of Super Rod to get 3 of any basic energy or Pokemon and put them back into our deck. I have found it's pretty easy to get carried away with how much energy you're discarding every turn, and also because we play Pokestop, that means there are going to be times where we might be discarding Pokemon or energy that we don't want to, so we do need some ways at getting those back. We have 2 copies of Switch Cart. We really never want to hard retreat our Pokemon with this deck just because our damage output is tied to the amount of energy we have in play, so instead we would rather play an item like this to move our Pokemon around. And also sometimes the 30 heal is a little bit relevant as well, especially against Charizard, where they might use their Charmanders to start poking out our Raging Bolt to set up a future KO. We can always just heal that off and make it a little bit tougher for them. And for our final trainer card, we have 1 copy of Palpad to get 2 supporters back into our deck. Like I've mentioned a few times, we are very reliant on using Sada most turns of the game, so Palpad is just a way we can recycle these, especially again since we are playing Pokestop. We might occasionally discard supporters that we might not want to. And to round out our deck list, we have 7 copies of Fighting Energy and 3 copies of Lightning Energy. As you can see, we are leaning a little bit more heavily on the Fighting Energy, just because that's the main energy Koraidon needs to attack, and that's the only kind that our Sandy Shocks can accelerate out of discard. But that's going to be my current deck list for Raging Bolt EX. From what we've seen so far in Japan, it looks like there are a couple of different ways to play this deck, so I'll be curious to know what you guys are thinking. Do you like this list that I have today? Are there any cards that you would change? Feel free to let me know down below in the comment section. If you did enjoy today's content, be sure to smack that like button for me. And if you're feeling maybe a little extra generous, you can always become a patron at patreon.com/rarecandytcg or pick up some merch over at rarecandytcg.com. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.